Hello everyone, welcome to the Yogascapes in Japan podcast series. My name is Amy McCartney. Yogascapes in Japan is a 2-year project funded by the Japanese Society for the Promotion of Science and is hosted by the Graduate School of Global Environmental Studies at Kyoto University, Japan. The aim of this project is to understand and document the popularity and consumption of global yoga within the Japanese cultural setting. In November 2018, we organised a 2-day international conference with the help of the Institute of Liberal Arts at Shisha University and the Organisation for Identity and Cultural Development. This podcast series showcases some of the presentations from the conference. Today's episode features Dr. Justin Stein from Bokyo University, Kyoto. His presentation is on Yoga in Early 20th Century Japan, Self-cultivation, Spiritual Therapies, and American Influences.
Hi. Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you so much to our organizers, Patrick and Amy, for allowing me to present with some very new research. This morning and yesterday, we saw some very developed projects. This is not one of those. I am talking about a new project that will hopefully become a publication. So if either in the Q&A or later on, this afternoon, this evening, you have any feedback for me about maybe potential directions to take this research in, I'd be very appreciative of that. And yeah, my title, as Diane said, Yoga in Early 20th Century Japan, Self-cultivation, Spiritual Therapies, and American Influences. Yesterday, Patrick mentioned that in the mid-1990s, with the Om Shinrikyo incident, their interest in yoga plummeted in Japan. It created maybe a trough, and he talked about in the early 21st century what he called second wave yoga. So if that was second wave was 21st century, I think this first wave would be in the 1970s. A lot of times in narratives about yoga in Japan, Vishnu Ghosh, who is credited as the father of Japanese yoga. Apparently there is a postage stamp with him proclaimed as such, a Japanese postage. I haven't been able to find it online. If anyone does come across an image of Vishnu Ghosh on a Japanese postage stamp, please email it to me. But he came in 1968 to Japan, shortly before his death. And in 1970, apparently, as the hagiography goes, his dying words to his student Bikram Chaudhuri were, to finish the task he had started and bring yoga to the world. And so Bikram actually had a center teaching briefly in Shinjuku, Tokyo in 1970, and apparently that was where he had his insight about hot yoga, and that he thought the Japanese students were all getting injured, and he realized it was too cold here, that they needed to reproduce the environment of India to reduce injuries. And so it's, at least in the hagiographic telling, this was his insight, was in Shinjuku. And he didn't stay very long in Japan, but his brother, Buddha, came to Tokyo the following year, I believe, 1971, and founded the Indo Yoga Kareji Tokyo, which is in Shibuya, which is still running today. I believe he still lectures and teaches there. So that's kind of one lineage of early 1970s yoga in Japan. Another really interesting one from the 1970s, I don't know if anyone's heard of Motoyama Hiroshi. He has founded the International Association for Religion and Parapsychology in Tokyo, and also the California Institute for Human Sciences in Encinitas, California. He was a Shinto priest, electrical engineer, parapsychological researcher, and yogi. He invented machines to measure chakra function and also the function of the meridians. Super interesting guy. I'd like to write about him someday, but that's not for today's presentation. But I just want to take a quick note for people who aren't familiar with Japanese names. In this presentation, Japanese names are presented in the native fashion, where the family name is first. Right, so he would be Mr. Motoyama, or actually Dr. Motoyama. I believe he has a PhD in electrical engineering. So yeah, we're going to switch from these Indic names to Japanese names, so the family name would be first. But today, rather than talk about this first wave, we talk about what you might call wave zero. the earliest that I know of forms of modern yoga in Japan in the early 20th century, in the decades 1910s and 1920s. And we're going to be talking about these three figures. Nukariya Kaiten, who wrote about yuga in kanji, the characters for yuga in the early 20th century, as opposed to the katakana that we see a lot today. These two interesting figures, the Kimoras, Hideo and Komako, who taught this thing that I actually would love. The inspiration for this work is actually here today. Yamada Shinichi Sensei. Would love to hear maybe your comment. I didn't clear this with you before. My translation of the kanjizai is maybe like seeing freely or seeing things as they really are. I'll get more into that, I guess, when I talk about them. And lastly, this Yamada Shinichi, who's someone known as the father of Japanese osteopathy, or Seitai, and he taught a Prana therapy in the 1920s. So this is kind of the overview. If you see on your handout, we're going to enter section 1, global yoga in the early 20th century, and then run through these three interesting figures, and then wrap up with some conclusions. I didn't start a timer. I should probably do that. How long are we spending? I just want to know how long we're talking about.
3:15.
Okay, so I'm 3 minutes in right now? 4 minutes. 4 minutes, okay. That's good to know. It's good to know. It's not reading, I'm just kind of talking off the cuff and we'll time this. So. All right. So a lot of the work that I'm presenting today is inspired by my colleague Philip DeSlip, who is currently a doctoral candidate at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Some of you may have seen his work about yoga in early 20th century America. These two articles are on the handout. If you're interested in reading more about the topic, he's one of the pioneers really looking at this period and these figures who've been kind of understudied in the narrative of Vivekananda, Yogananda, and these better-known figures. And what he's found, looking in what he calls the Swami Circuit of early 20th century America, these less-known, many Sikh swamis, yogis, who were traveling around the United States, teaching various practices they call yoga, is the following. Basically, first of all, there is this Orientalist interest in metaphysical Asia that goes back to the 19th century, movements like Theosophy, so there was this kind of yearning for physical practices or lectures on Eastern philosophy that was not really available maybe in the time of the Theosophists, that became available as Indian Americans or Indians began immigrating to the U.S. But also many of these practices integrated aspects of American metaphysical religion, such as mesmerism, right, the kind of vitalist therapies, which often also get syncretized with spiritualism. So laying on of hands, the passing of the hands, right, to do healings. The talk, prana, kind of very in similar terms as what was being talked about as animal magnetism at the time, right, forms of vital force. And also New Thought, right, the idea that the mind is the primary thing in the universe, that disease and other misfortunes are caused by incorrect thinking, and so by correcting the mind, one could affect the universe. And also physical culture has been well documented by Mark Singleton and others, right, in the postural yoga. And Philip, I think, is really helpful, brings this kind of attention to these traveling teachers offering these kind of 3 stages of teachings. First, arriving in a town, offering a free lecture where, in a large public setting, hundreds or even thousands of potential students coming to hear a lecture, see a demonstration. Certainly an entertainment factor there, as well as people just interested in the mystic East. Then followed by a small private group where people pay for a series of classes with the yogi, and then finally, maybe for the most well-off students, very expensive, often dyadic sessions of healing or lectures or classes, one-on-one with a famous the self-proclaimed famous yogi from India. And what we see in this breathing techniques dietary teachings, hygiene, philosophy, positive thinking, physical exercise, things that we associate with yoga, but also with other movements at the time, so kind of making things relevant for these audiences, as well as maybe drawing inspiration from local things. Should be noted here, many of these people who were self-proclaimed yogis were not Indian, had never been to India. There were African Americans, there were whites, people from the Middle East who took this public interest in yoga as a marketing opportunity to brand themselves as from the subcontinent and creating fanciful names for themselves. Phil gets more into that. And here's an example from Dallas that created a big legal case. And a lot of these actually created scandals, particularly around ideas of tantra and things like that. There was kind of Victorian era America, prudish values. Male teachers and female students created a lot of tabloid headlines and court cases. Yogi Wasan, I believe for his work in Dallas, was taken to court. Philip describes this in his article. Again, I just wanted this class. You can see a number of his devotees donning turbans, and so this kind of idea of becoming the other, the othering the self that Jens talked about this morning, has a much longer historical trajectory rather than this kind of Orientalist revival in the late 20th century. Okay, so in Japan, we see very similar things going on as in the United States. So I want to kind of talk about this as a maybe global movement, or global is kind of a fraught term, but at least translocal, transoceanic, transnational movement outside the U.S. And I don't think really this has been much written about yet, which is kind of exciting. That there were Japanese traveling to the U.S., learning yogic practices there, bringing them back to Japan. There were also yogic texts produced in the United States that were being translated into Japanese in this period. And the context in the U.S., we talked about metaphysical religion, new thought, physical culture. In Japan, there was a movement going on called Meijutsu, which probably many of you have not heard of, or Seishin Yoho, which in contemporary Japan means psychotherapy, but at that time referred to these techniques of self-cultivation, which have a longer historical trajectory going back to the early modern period, healing practices, including what looks a lot like mesmerism, what Yoshinagi Sensei has translated as mind cure, people doing visualization techniques, reciting affirmations, much like the law of attraction that was going on in the United States. Let's say kind of secret. Some of you may be familiar with this kind of idea that like produces like. If you create positive thinking, you'll have positive things in your life. If your misfortunes are happening to you, it's because you're manifesting them with your negative thoughts. So these types of ideas were not just popular in late 19th, early 20th century America, but we're also crossing over to Japan through some of these figures like I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, and yes, for further reference, check out Yoshinagi Sensei and my colleague Yamada Shinichi's work on your handout. I'll get a hang of which one is forward and which one is back. Yeah, the top one is forward. All right. So, first figure I'm going to be talking about today, Nukaria Kaiten. Very interesting figure, not just for his work on yoga, but very prolific Buddhist scholar in the late 19th and early 20th century, from Soto Zen sect. So that Zen Yoga is maybe the first Zen Yoga, well, at least in the modern period. He was the head of Komazawa Daigaku in Tokyo, and he studied at Harvard between 1911 and 1913. He became fluent in English sometime by the late 19th century. He translated a book of Paul Carouse, the American Buddhist modernist, into Japanese. And he, I'd say he's probably in this third generation of Japanese Buddhists studying abroad, learning Western religious studies kind of stuff, Buddhology kind of stuff abroad, and coming back to Japan and bringing kind of Western scholastic traditions from abroad. That began in the early 1870s. So he's coming out of this tradition. He wasn't a pioneer in that sense. But what he was a pioneer in was at Harvard, he encountered Vedanta, yogic philosophy, and several yogic practices that we'll talk about shortly. And wrote, upon his return, this book, Yoki Renshin no Jiken. So it's cultivating ki and polishing or training the mind experiments to do this. And it's a really interesting book. It's very long. I have not read it in its entirety. I've skimmed through it. I've talked a little bit about its contents. But yeah, I'm looking forward to diving deeper into all the stuff in here. But in the preface, he talks about kind of his experiences in Boston, encountering Christian Science, encountering New Thought, and encountering yoga, and saying that there seems to be this spirit in the air in America at this time, that he kind of wants to transmit this to Japan. And he calls it Seishin Shugi, which Seishin could be spirit, Shugi is ism, so like spiritualism, but distinct from, we think of like the spiritualist movement in America. But also like maybe mentalism, Seishin could also be the mind. So there's this thing about spiritualism, mentalism. And yeah, you see this first chapter, there's this preface about this, and then the first chapter as well, the dawn of spiritualism, mentalism. And then throughout the book, he gets more into different practices. And you might think this doesn't look so different from, more modern, what we think of as kind of late 20th century books on yogic philosophy, talking about breathing technique, pranayama, meditation. I really want to read this chapter in more depth. Differences between North American and Indian yoga, sounds very promising. The relationship between the relatives, where we know he's getting Vedanta stuff. And yeah, Patanjali is a chapter on. So this is pretty interesting. In 1913, Japan, this is coming from his time in Harvard. This is like the first book he writes, basically, when he gets back. And he has a wonderful bibliography from which we can find where he is getting this information. And interesting, there's basically two authors that make up the vast majority of this bibliography. Yogi Ramacharaka and Swami Vivekananda. And anyone familiar with either of these names? Yeah. So Yogi, let's start with Swami Vivekananda, is actually the brother of Yogananda. He was asked by Vivekananda to take over the Vedanta Society of New York, which Vivekananda had founded in 1893, and a few years later, Abhidananda takes over as the president of the Vedanta Society, writes many books. I think it's something like 50 or 60 books about his name. None of them seem to be translated into Japanese. So Mukadiya's book, where he summarizes, he doesn't do a direct translation, but he summarizes, I think, a number of these books by Abhidananda, seems to be the primary conduit for that information on Vedanta and other yogic practices into Japanese. And this book that I've been talking about, Yoki Renshin no Jiken, is well cited in the next generation by people interested in yogic stuff. The other figure, the one who actually the most cited figure in Mukadiya's bibliography, Yogi Ramacharaka, was the pen name of William Walker Atkinson, a New Thought writer who lived most of his life in Chicago and Los Angeles. As you see, Caucasian American, European American, writing under an Indian pen name, who my colleague I mentioned before, Philip Slip, is writing his dissertation about, and I'm really looking forward to seeing that. A very interesting character, combines a number of different types of practices under the name of the yogic science of breath or pranic healing, where he's also selling the same practices under more Western names too, so kind of maybe getting different audiences by talking about these things in different ways. Okay, so moving on to our next figure, because I realize I'm probably talking a little too much. Kimura Hideo, you see here, he's piercing his arm, and then there's a photo series, I'll show you the next one later, pulling the piercing out, doesn't bleed, right? Kind of this demonstration of his mastery over the body through his mastery of the mind. He was born in the southernmost island of Kyushu, Kumamoto, and thanks to his uncle, who was a soy sauce brewer, a wealthy soy sauce brewer, he actually came here to study at Doshisha University, and he was very interested in religion, and he wanted to go study in the U.S. He studied English. He was a exchange student at the University of California in Berkeley from 1905 to 1906, where he encountered the Theosophical Society. spiritualism, Christian Science, and Tantra, interestingly. And you might be, what kind of tantrikas were active in Northern California in 1905, 1906 is Pierre Bernard, the great Om, or the omnipotent Om, a couple of books I've written about him, founded the Tantric order in America, in Oakland, and also in Seattle. He got in a lot of legal trouble. He was on the run a lot. We moved to New York a few years later. So Kimura really got him at the right time in the Bay Area. And Yoshinaga-sensei has written a little bit about this based on the book by Kimura's wife that I'm going to talk about briefly in a minute. But in their encounter, Bernard gave him an initiatory experience with what seems to be a psychedelic drug he said it was a blue-black liquid, and he drank it, and he has this out-of-body experience, and he realizes kind of the limits of his ordinary experience and the power of the mind, and becomes a devoted follower of Bernard over the course of basically the next year. Returning to Japan, he founds this Nihon Shinrei Kenkyukai, the Japanese Association for Spiritual Research. He is taking up some of these practices. Bernard was known for simulating death. Doctors would come and try to take his pulse, or feel his heart rate, breathing, and apparently his temperature would go down. Very good at simulating death. It seems like Kimura also did some of these kind of control over the body to demonstrate his powers, gain followers. He charged large sums of money for instruction. So he had a small following out of upper-class elites. And in 1907, he meets a young woman from his hometown who's also beneficiary of his uncle's largesse. The two of them basically run off together. They're like the Scandal of Kumamoto. And he forms this religious organization that's kind of like the sect of like seeing clearly, or sect of seeing freely. And in the book that she writes about him and his teachings, it seems that the imagination is this major thing, which basically is the power of the mind to manifest things in this world. So I have to get, again, another book I have to get deeper into to find out more about, but it seems that based on some of Bernard's teachings, he creates this new religious movement about kind of manifesting changes in physical reality through the power of the mind. So some sort of tantric connection here, some sort of, and certainly he's demonstrating his yogic powers as a means of gaining followers. This is Kumamoto, who actually herself is a really interesting figure. She was one of the earliest feminists in Japan. She was a part of this New Woman Society. She was also an actress and a dancer. And while she was in New York on a stint, she was marching in the streets for women's suffrage. And herself a very interesting character. But yeah, this is from the frontispiece for her 1914 book. So let me keep going. One more figure. Yamada Shinichi, as I mentioned, someone described as the father of Japanese osteopathy. I'm not sure osteopathy is really the greatest description, because although in this 3-volume set, so this is the volume 1, Prana therapy, volume 2 is called osteopathy, so it's definitely a term he used himself. But Japanese Seitai is not really Western osteopathy, and his form of Seitai, the Yamada Shiki Seitai, draws on stuff like from Ramacharaka, who I mentioned before, William Walker Atkinson's Prana healing. This seems to be, this is my own translation, maybe a little work, but seems to be inspired maybe by the work of Ramacharaka. Yamada writes, Prana is a word used by Indian philosophers to describe the substance that is the source of the energy that creates the universe. I think in Japanese you could call it seiryoku, or reiki. Of course, prana is immaterial. It's like the human soul, so it cannot be seen or heard. But according to Indian philosophers, what we normally see as the universe is full of this prana, where it manifests as heat, light, magnetism, and electricity. It is in human origins, human beginnings, and allows all plants and animals to stay alive. This is, I mean, again, not that different from what you find in any late 20th century book for general audiences on yoga and yogic thought. But at this time, it seems to be fairly unusual linking this, much more prevalent vitalist philosophy specifically to prana. Maybe, one of the earliest, aside from Vivekananda's book and other, forgot to mention, there were numerous translations of Ramacharaka's books into Japanese in the 1910s and 1920s. This is maybe one of the first people teaching it under his own thing, not as this is what is going on in the U.S. and these American yogis, but this is Yamada Shiki, this is Yamada style osteopathy, and I'm going to tell you about prana. His book, as I said, the 3-volume set is filled with different therapeutic techniques, some involving manipulations of the body, others involving finger pressure, and he talks about techniques by which one can cultivate prana in one's body through breath, to circulate the prana throughout the body, and to charge certain objects with prana, to transmit prana into others' bodies, to heal them or to heal oneself, using hands, using breath, using the gaze. This stuff may not sound so unusual to people, but this is, again, in early 20th century Japan, I think at least other people are doing similar things, which I'll talk about in the conclusion, but specifically attributing it to ancient Indian philosophers to gain some sort of authority seems to be fairly unusual at this time. And then also, a distance healing technique. So I got into this, by the way. My previous research is about Reiki, the healing practice, and as I mentioned, he says you could. I think in Japanese, prana is basically the same as Reiki. So that's how I actually heard about this book first, was through this reference. And a lot of the practices that he's teaching here that are adapted from Ramacharaka's work, or seem to be adapted from Ramacharaka's work, are also similar to the teachings of Usuide Gyoho, or the originary practices that became what in the West is just known as Reiki. So there's this kind of common set of practices here, but the difference, right, is that they're ascribing these practices to India using foreign names, specifically Sanskrit-derived vocabulary, to talk about them. And so, what is going on here? Why is this interesting? What do we want to get out of this? One thing is, I think that there is this kind of, again, I'm skeptical of the word global, but certainly this transnational network of actors interested in India, interested in practices for healing, for self-cultivation. They're using breathing techniques, physical exercises, training the mind, laying on of hands, in order to better the self and to heal. Unlike in the U.S., or it's actually it's kind of a parallel of the U.S., right? In the U.S., where these things are being combined with practices that were developed locally, mesmerism, new thought. In Japan, it's kind of a second order of this, right, where they're importing, right, these practices that were developed in the U.S. to Japan and readapting them for local audiences. The hypnotism boom had been kind of one of the things that precipitated this Reijutsu movement. And Kimura, I believe, which I maybe confirm for me, was a hypnotist at some point as well. That there was this idea of the power of the mind to influence the body psychosomatically, health being related in mysterious ways to the mental. Again, in Japanese, I didn't really mention this. I mentioned this a little bit at the very beginning, but a lot of these words, when I'm translating as spirit or I'm translating as mind, actually are more ambiguous than that. So what you might call spiritual techniques, when you talk about Reijutsu or Seishin Yoho, spiritual and mental, so like mind cure and spiritual healing, you could kind of use the same term. It means both of those things, right? So the slipperiness of some of these words is also kind of interesting. The power of the mind, the power of the spirit are not separate. Right? They're kind of a similar thing. So again, when we talk about transculturation, the contingencies of local context, linguistic issues is another kind of interesting thing. How is yoga maybe differently in context might also be contingent on a few of those things. Who participated in these movements? Again, as I mentioned, I don't have a lot of this reception data, but Kimura's followers seem to have been, a small group of very wealthy people. Yamada actually gives a ton of instruction in his 3 sets, so anyone who could afford those books may have been able to practice rather than having to pay for expensive lessons. He did have a practice center, though, kind of like a dojo, so I'm sure that kind of the least expensive way to get involved with that would be to read his books, but then other people who are more dedicated might actually go and study under him for more money. And finally, there's a lot of work coming out that's very interesting about the appeal of India in Japanese Buddhism in the modern period, and this idea of India as a originary source being used for narrative authenticity, not exclusive to yoga, of course. Buddhism, also having been developed in India, had been for a long time in Japanese Buddhist context in this Sangoku narrative of India, 3 countries, India, China, Japan, sometimes as an evolutionary narrative that Japan got Buddhism the best, sometimes as a de-evolutionary narrative that the original golden age of Shaka has now become so corrupt by the clergy, and so we need to restore it to its original, and especially in this period, scientific, rational practice, right? So this idea of India and Indic masters may have had some sort of special appeal in the 20th century, especially in the Buddhist context. We saw it. So that's about where I'm at, and I think I'm about at time. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. Stay tuned for more episodes. In the meantime, please have a look at the Yogascapes in Japan website at yogascapesinjapan.com. And also, if you are feeling generous, please think about making a donation through the GoFundMe account linked to the website. Until next time.